Again, thank you very much. The topic is quite interesting. We're going to talk about resource nationalism and especially the rethinking about resource nationalism. So resource nationalism has prominently, featured in a policy discussion over the years, largely focusing on contentious relationship between state and extractive company over a fair sharing of economic benefits. In the current context, of the ongoing scramble to secure minerals that are critical for low carbon transition and renewable industry. Governments of many producer countries, actually globally, are increasingly imposing export restrictions on unprocessed minerals as a strategy to encourage investment in midstream value addition. So this trend really signals a possible start of a new wave of resource nationalism worth rethinking about what are the triggers, implications, both for governments and also for companies. But the bottom line is not about cash grab. The bottom line is how to strike the right balance, in terms of sharing the benefits. Because the tension is really about each party playing a legitimate mandate that they are being given. So the governments protect the interest of the country, but companies are also protecting the interest of their shareholders. Now, to discuss this topic, which is quite interesting with me, I would like to introduce my panelists. To my immediate left is Claude Basak. Claude is CEO of the Euromix based in South Africa. And then we have Hume Skoll, director at the Malan Shores company, and Warren Beach, chief executive officer of Beach Veltam in South Africa. Then we have Jeff Quantamine, the CEO, Precious Mining in Australia. And then we have Dr. Benedito Paul Manuel, the managing director of the Katoka in Angola. So let's go straight to the conversation. Let me start with Claude. Resource nationalism as a concept, what does it really mean, and what are the key triggers for the resource nationalism strategies, especially from economic point of view?
Okay,
Warren?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So, look, the problem with the word resource nationalism is that it's a very negative connotation. Nationalism is, by definition, something that is bad from the side of the companies that invest, okay, and that is necessity and good for the perspective of the governments and the communities. So, what's very interesting about mining, and is quite exceptional, and it's the nature of the business, is that you have this infamous commodity cycle, right? And this commodity cycle of boom and bust is something that fundamentally changes on a permanent basis the relationships between all the key parties in making mining workable. When prices are good and profits are good, right, governments will look at mining companies and say, we're not getting our fair share. And you start having conversations about resource rent taxes, or you're talking about having free carries, or you're talking about expropriation or nationalization or expropriation without compensations. When times are good, then we don't have those conversations. So you have a very clear correlation between the waves of resource nationalism and the commodity prices. And one and the other, and this is what my data shows, is actually these feed into each other, this cyclical relationship between this request for more by the local communities and this capacity to produce more revenues and profits by the mining industry feed into each other. And so we have an exaggeration of the cyclicality of mining. So how do we defeat that? Well, we need to start looking at the fundamental of mineral economics, because that's where it starts. You see, mining is not like oil and gas industry. The oil and gas industry is extremely resilient to state ownership and lack of investment by state petroleum companies. Because oil, the cost is in exploration and development, and then that thing pumps itself out, right? So if you look at the typical GDP composition of an oil-rich country that has discovered oil, within 2 or 3 years of that, oil represents 70–80% of GDP. The highest GDP contribution you're going to see of mining in any country that has nothing else, say like Mauritania, where they have iron ore, is 30–35% when the iron ore prices is at historical high. Then there's an onset of nationalization or stuff like that. Mining industry is chased away and that resource is sterilized. Look at Zambia, right? Look at 50, 60 years of cycles of nationalizations and then privatization and nationalization. Result is Zambia and Chile used to produce the same amount of copper in 1970, 700,000 tons. Then Zambia nationalized its mining industry and production collapsed to 200,000 tons per annum by the late 1990s, and resource rents were zero, i.e. nationalization sterilized the mining industry in Zambia, and then they had to privatize it. And then we had this incident with Vedanta, KCM, and all of that, where they redid the same mistake. The cost to Zambia in terms of lost resource rents between 1970 and 2000 was $50 billion. So the policy intent was to get more. The result was they got a lot less. By the time Zambia privatized and got back to 700,000 tons, Chile was on 6 million tons of copper produced. Now, I am not saying that Zambia wanting more is wrong. What I'm saying is, how do we engage in long-term mechanisms so that we all have our fair share over not just the good time, but the bad times? Let's embed the understanding that prices go up and down, that the price of capital increases and decreases, that the availability of capital changes. And mining is not like oil. Oil pumps itself naturally out of the soil, and all you have to do is record it. Every ton of metal that you extract from the ground makes the next ton of metal to extract more expensive. It's diminishing returns in mining. So until and unless we as governments, as community, a mining company, understands the long-term 50-year cycles, we will continue fighting at the wrong time, over the wrong issue, sterilizing our mining industry.
Thank you very much, Claude, for that. Increasingly, mineral-rich countries are, imposing restrictions on the export, apart from the fiscal aspects that Claude talked about. So, Hume, is this a signal of a wider trend across the continent, and how mining companies have actually responded to that?
That perhaps the unpopular view is that, which I have, is that governments should not get involved in mining. Governments are not nimble enough to be involved in mining themselves. I mean, let's look at South Africa, for example. Assuming that your government is properly run and is administratively competent, the government, even in those situations, is subject to the Public Finance Management Act. It can't take decisions quickly enough, it's not nimble enough to run mining operations. Governments should make their investment environment as friendly as possible. And what governments get out of it is taxes, royalties, beneficiation run by commercial enterprises in their countries, etc. And more importantly, they get happy citizens. Employed citizens are happy citizens. For governments to get directly involved in mining doesn't work. I only know of one example, perhaps, and I'm willing to be corrected here. Botswana is a good example of where it worked, because that was a commercial arrangement. Governments can only mine if it's a commercial arrangement, if they fund their way like any other shareholder. Free carry is, in my view, a nonsense. It doesn't work. Because the government gets nothing out of a free carry until the funding shareholder or partner has been repaid its loans. The loans never get paid back. So why even have a free carry? You're not going to get no benefit out of it. Make your environment investor-friendly, good tax regime, good administration, an easy cadastre, a predictable royalty rate. All of those things will make the government get the maximum out of its resources. Trying to get involved itself is not going to change anything or work.
Thank you. Again, there's a point there, not adding value, the value addition in country is really not about the government, extracting or getting into mining, but working with partners to really add value in their country, and that would help countries capture a bit more value. What would you say about that?
I think, Silas, if market conditions determine that it makes economic sense to beneficiate in the country, then do it. There are examples, and Claude, you've done the maths with Zimbabwe, for example, wanting to build a PGM smelter in Zim. It sounds like a good idea, but it doesn't make economic sense. That sort of need, which is understandable, to get more out of your minerals by beneficiating in country, does not always make economic sense. So what should drive any decision to beneficiate should be market forces. Let the market dictate what the government should do, not let the government try and tell the market what it should do. It doesn't work, in my view. Again, I stand to be corrected, but that's my experience.
Thank you very much for that. And now, Warren, I think there is, there is a kind of an understanding that it might not make an economic sense, as Hume said, to add value for every kind of mine in the country. However, there has been efforts within the region, for countries to coordinate and collaborate so that they can create, economic scale to attract investment. And one of the initiatives that we are seeing is the Zambia-DRC collaboration on a precursor battery project. So, and I know you have been involved into this. What would be your take? Can this really resolve the question of economies of scale for countries to make, to add value in there?
Thank you, Silas. So, again, I think we need to just remember that there's a scale, or there's a continuum, and everybody tends to know when the term nationalization is used. And as Claude says, and he interchangeably went nationalism and nationalization, but the negative connotations with nationalization, full government control, full government ownership of the assets is something which a lot of people feel awkward about. But more important, I don't think that we are sending the correct messages out. And when I talk about we, it's every single person in this room that's a stakeholder in this mining industry. The messaging that we're sending is not correct. Nationalism is a continuum from simple things like taxes and like royalties all the way through to nationalization. And that for me is one of the challenges. We talk about collaboration. But collaboration is, again, just a word. And we need to get better at communicating what we're already doing in every single country on nationalism. And you mentioned the Zambia DRC Cobalt Copper Initiative. That is nationalism because it adds value in a continuum for those countries that are participating and every other country around. The De Beers Indiama announcement this week, same. It's not just about investment in exploration or investment in production. It's investment in technology, SMMEs. And again, if you listen to some of the speakers from the DRC this week, very, very clear, local content is critical. So if you want to invest there, local content is critical. And SMME development is critical. And he used one of the Honourable Katum mentioned that the SMEs that have been created from mining is a soap-making factory. And it's important, it's part of the economy. All of that lends, and it benefits the economy more generally. So nationalism is a continuum. It's about us messaging that correctly. Again, we're in a very, very difficult, and let me take South Africa again as an example. We're in a very difficult stage again. Leading up to elections, we are seeing the protest action. We are seeing the communities standing at the mine gates because government's not delivering on basic services. And that delivery on the social and labour plans is all part of resource nationalism, but we don't package it and we don't message it properly. But it can work, and the regional initiatives and even in-country initiatives are an important part of nationalism.
Thank you very much. With that, let us get a perspective of the operators themselves. So Jeff, being an operator in the mining sector, what does all this mean to a company like Precious Mining Limited that is emerging as a mid-tier gold mining, as well as positioned to meaningfully contribute to the growth of mining on the African continent? What does all this mean?
Yeah, well, look, thanks for that. I mean, this is a fairly emotive kind of subject at times, and does depend on how you interpret and what your relationship to the whole thing is. So I should say at the outset, I mean, I was introduced as being from Australia, and yes, I am from Australia, but our company is totally African and all of our activities are based on the African continent. But I would make the observation that this discussion is not particular to Africa. This is a conversation that occurs everywhere in the world, and in fact it occurs quite regularly in Australia, which is also a very mineral-rich kind of province. Now, there are various schools of thought as to what it means and how it affects people. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, you might have people who are espousing anti-colonial rhetoric, basically, and are sort of seeking to more nationalism or nationalisation on that basis. On the other hand, I think that people who are proposing this kind of approach are genuinely interested in enhancing the prospects of their community and the people of their nation. And where we as a mining company fall, in our position, is very strongly into that camp. Our corporate mission, as it were, is to generate benefits for all of our stakeholders in fair and equitable proportions. And it's that last piece of that mission that is the very key element, the fair and equitable proportions. And it is what is fair and what is equitable, and how does it take place. Now, a lot of this discussion's been very much orientated to the fiscal side of things, the straight fiscal measures, but I would argue that resource nationalism, for want of a term, goes further than that. I mean, certainly, equity ownership was mentioned earlier on, carried interest, and it doesn't work. Well, I would argue that it does work. I mean, it may not work in terms of getting cash return immediately, but it gives host governments skin in the game, so to speak. It gives them an interest in how that resource is being allocated and being used. And after all, it is the property of the country. So I think that ownership of assets does make sense, provided it's done in a moderate kind of a way, because it has to be recognised that if you have too much of the interest is a carried interest, the economics simply don't work for the developer, in which case we don't develop, in which case nobody gets a benefit out of the whole thing. So this is a case of fair and equitable and balanced thinking. Another area where this comes to the fore is in the discussion around local employment. Now, local employment, I think, is a very important piece, and this is a way that real benefits can be transferred to host communities, because through that local employment there's training, there's upskilling, and these are things that are going to be present forever and can be utilised in different ways. So, I think that's a sensible thing too. However, once again, by being unbalanced in the way it's administered, it can actually cause a mining operation to go from being profitable to not being profitable by having too many people employed or not having the right skill sets deployed. And on it goes. When you could have a discussion around local procurement. We've seen situations where we've had to transfer our purchasing of particular materials from an overseas supplier to a local supplier who has simply gone and bought the same materials from our overseas supplier, clipped the ticket on the way through. So great for the development of an entrepreneurial class, but doesn't do anything at all for the capacity of the country. So, I think that this whole thing, this is a much broader debate than straight up, economic return to the government. I think there's a lot of elements to it, but we firmly believe that it's our duty to, if we're going to be operating on the continent, if we're going to be hosted by countries and by communities, they must get their fair share. The challenge is to figure out what that fair share actually looks like.
Thank you very much. On that note, a fair share. So again, still from the operator perspective, we have Dr. Benedito. What would be your take on this?
Bom, muito obrigado. Eu penso que, em primeiro lugar, nós não devemos nos assustar com a perspectiva de repensar a questão da nacionalização dos recursos. É claro que sempre que falamos em nacionalização, isso nos remete a conceito em termos de política econômica, que vai para o lado político assustador,
that go to a very scary political side,
considerando do ponto de vista histórico,
considering the historical point,
o estrago que a nacionalização fez para a economia de muitos países.
The harm that economic took for other countries.
Mas sem ir numa vertente política, falando como operador,
but without going to a political side, speaking as an operator,
eu penso que é importante entender o que é que se pretende.
I feel like it is very important and compulsory to understand what do we really want.
Meus senhores, é preciso nós entendermos que os recursos minerais exploram-se há muitos e muitos anos.
We need to understand that the mineral resources or the mineral resources, they have been explored from very long ago.
Os recursos minerais são responsáveis pelo desenvolvimento que a humanidade atingiu hoje.
The mineral resources, they are responsible for the evolvement that the world has gotten nowadays.
Como nós podemos ver aqui, sem os recursos minerais, não estaríamos a nos comunicar nesta sala, não teríamos o nível de saúde que nós temos, não teríamos o nível de iluminação, de energia que nós temos. Portanto, a qualidade de vida que nós temos hoje depende em grande parte do desenvolvimento da exploração dos recursos minerais.
As we can see, without the exploration of the mining resources, we wouldn't have the communication that we have now, the type of life we have now. We wouldn't have many of the good things we have nowadays.
A questão que se coloca é a seguinte:
the question that is posed is the following:
se os recursos minerais,
if the mining resources
tem grande contributo para o desenvolvimento da humanidade,
contribute so greatly for the evolvement of humanity,
a grande verdade, porém, também é de que
the great truth is that
muitos dos países ou nações onde são explorados estes recursos,
many of the countries or most of the countries where these resources are explored,
são os que menos contributo em termos de desenvolvimento recebem, portanto, daquilo que deveria ser o papel dos recursos minerais.
Are the ones that less contributes they receive for the involvement of their very same communities.
E eu creio que é dali que surge a tendência
And I believe that is from there where the trends come
das políticas de muitos países exigirem que os minerais possam conhecer o processamento nos seus países e não apenas a exportação.
whereat many countries impose that the countries may know or should know the process in which this exploration takes, and not only giving the production, but they need to know from the bottom where it starts.
Então, neste aspecto, eu como operador também defendo
So in this aspect, me as an operator, I'm apologist
que o Estado não se deve substituir aos operadores.
that the state or the governor or the government does not oppose upon the operators.
Mas o Estado tem sim responsabilidades para ditar políticas de Estado
Yet the state or the government has the authority to dictate policies according to the state
que permitam um ambiente de negócios em que o operador, o investidor, invista e tenha os seus ganhos,
that would allow a business environment where the operator may invest and have his or her own profits,
mas que os recursos explorados tenham verdadeiro impacto no desenvolvimento das nações onde eles são explorados.
but that these very same resources that are being explored, they may have a great impact in the communities where they've been explored.
E temos que entender isso como um conceito de uma humanidade saudável,
And we need to understand this as a concept of a healthy humanity.
porque nós não podemos olhar para os recursos simplesmente numa perspectiva econômica.
Because we cannot just look at the resources in an economic perspective.
É preciso olhar a perspectiva social,
We need to look upon the social perspective as well.
e eu até diria preciso olhar para a perspectiva antropológica.
And I would say, according to the anthropology, we need to look into that perspective as well.
Então, é aqui a necessidade de, e está bem o termo repensar, a necessidade de ouvirem-se e encontrarem-se todas as partes,
And I would say that it is very well said, the terminology, rethinking. So I say that there is a need for us to re-encounter
para a busca daquilo que o Peter disse de equidade.
so that we may seek what Peter say concerning equity.
Mas o mundo explorador dos recursos minerais
But the exploring world of the mineral resources
tem que entender
needs to
que
understand that
com o desenvolvimento da tecnologia,
with the evolvement of technology,
com a expansão do conhecimento,
with the expansion of knowledge,
temos que buscar um paradigma de maior justiça social no aproveitamento dos benefícios do recurso dos recursos minerais que este planeta proporciona.
we need to find ways to get advantage of these exploring ways that these resources provide to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado. So I can see, Warren, you want to... Claude, sorry. Claude, you want to intervene?
Well, this is because this is Benedito. This is very, very powerful what you said. And it's very powerful, very true, and also fundamentally false. And this is the problem of why we have these fundamental disputes about natural resources, and particularly mineral resources. What you said that is very powerful and very true is that the great paradox is that the vast majority of that material, which will end up in our cell phones and our cars, come from the countries which benefit the least in terms of the value, the economic value. Yet they are the ones who suffer the most from the damages, because mining is a destructive industry, and because this is a resource that is extracted only once and is gone forever. The problem with that thinking is that while it is true, and therefore we need to find ways to make that fair and sustainable, we tend to derive from this logic a flawed notion that because we have that stuff, it is in finite quantity, we therefore need to capture as much of the value of it downstream. That is where it doesn't work. There is a reason why the massive volume of that stuff is worth very little at extraction. It's because it hasn't been processed. And it is true that the processing and the end, I mean, what in that thing is the actual total value of the minerals that it contains is almost nothing. As a metal, even as a fabricated piece of equipment, it is almost nothing. The value of this thing is in the software, and it is in the chips, and it is the advanced technologies that make it a phone. A piece of metal is only a piece of metal. A piece of rock containing metal is a piece of rock containing metal. A piece of dirt is a piece of dirt. The problem is not that we should find ways to extract more value and capture more of the value chain because the economies of scale don't exist, because of the market not existing. It's not an accident. It's in to try to shortcut that is to misunderstand mineral economics. No country in the world currently has developed their economy on the back of mining. This doesn't mean that having mining is bad news. What it means is that we have to find imaginative ways that make economic sense and make social sense and make equitable sense and moral sense and political sense, that there is fair sharing. But I'm from Mauritius, right? And Mauritius is one of the largest world producers of some very specialized types of garments, far more competitive in those tiny value chains than China, okay? If I apply the notion that I should have a manufacturing process in a manufacturing industry whereby I'm manufacturing valuable stuff that I sell to the world market because I have cotton in my field, in my land, then I go to Mauritius and I should say, well then, where's my cotton field from which that yarn comes, from which that textile was made, from which that piece of fabric was made, which led to the manufacturing of that textile? It doesn't happen. Mauritius doesn't produce cotton. It imports cotton. It cannot produce cotton economically. It can produce garments economically. The point about economic diversification and growth through minerals is not what we should fabricate downstream if it doesn't make economic sense, or even who should own what share. I don't care if government own shares in the mining companies. If it makes sense, it makes sense. What's important, all right, is what do we do with the income generated at the right level of value added in that country where it's economic, and that income is a catalyst for economic transformation and sustainable growth. And that's what must happen. Now, if you look at Malaysia, that's a country that understood that you can have oil and gas resources and mineral resources, but that's not going to create massive jobs. Never will, never has. So what they did is they created special economic zones where the ample, cheap labor could be employed in industries that have no common bearing whatsoever with mining, extraction, or oil and gas production. Let's think outside of the box. Let's separate owning that stuff in the ground from imagining that we will be producing millions of stuff. It's not the same stuff. It's a catalyst, nothing more.
Thank you very much, Claude. We're running out of time and we need to wind up. So maybe I start with Warren, and then we can go to Hume as we wind up. So what is your final take? Your final take.
So two experiences, and then it'll come to the point. So Hume and I are both lawyers, and we started out in the industry in very similar ways. We were onsetters. worked underground, and essentially we were the people that rang the bells to take conveyances up and down. So deeply, deeply embedded from a very early age or part of our career. And in the late 90s, and it's absolutely cringeworthy now when I think about it, but in the 90s I was involved in a mine closure in Tsumeb in Namibia. And the thinking was so bizarre, and again, as I said, it's cringeworthy now that I was actually even involved, but where you could leave a sewage plant and think that it would survive after the mine closes when you take all the electricians away, the artisans away. And those experiences and everything that we're going through now at the mines leaves me with one, and I have no doubt about this, if there is no immediate real benefit to the host communities, and I mean immediate, the mines will burn.
Thank you.
That's that for me. So I understand free carry and I understand the longer term benefits, but you can't eat free carry. And that's for me one of the most important things from my experiences.
Thank you very much. Hume, what is your last take?
I think a very important thing has been said here, and Warren touched on it, Claude, and it's about the fair share. I visited a first quantum mine in Zambia, and over 32 years of doing this, I visited many mines, but what really stuck out there was the way that communities benefit directly from that operation. For example, during COVID, First Quantum bought a radio station near the operation and broadcast lessons. They employed teachers, they broadcast lessons to 44,000 school children in that area. So there has to be a fair share. And the fair share, as Warren correctly says, is communities benefiting directly from the mining operation. So when I said earlier that governments shouldn't get directly involved in mining, I didn't mean that the mining companies should come in and be extractive and take everything out. The communities and the procurement must stay in that, well, obviously the communities stay in the country, but procurement should stay in the country as much as possible. Community development, skills transfer, all of those things have to happen. So this concept of the fair share does occur.
Thank you. The concept of fair share. Jeff, your very final take.
Yeah, this has been an interesting panel, I have to say. I mean, you got people sort of with very interesting and different views. It is disappointing to me, though, that there's nobody from a government on this panel willing to speak on the subject, because that is really would have added quite significantly to the debate. I mean, from my perspective, I am involved with a company. I spend a lot of time on the ground sitting and talking to the people whose resources are being used and who are the beneficiaries of the activity. And I think that gives us perspective that perhaps other people don't have in terms of what all this really means for people. So I think this is as a subject, it's one that is never going to be solved by 4 or 5 blokes sitting up here, having a bit of a yarn. This is a very complex subject, and it does need to be debated, and it does need to be debated thoroughly by all of the participants, all of the people who have got a stake in the thing, rather than just sort of, expressing views from a fairly narrow perspective. But thank you very much for the opportunity of joining the panel.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And Dr. Paulo, please, your last word.
Também digo que foi painel interessante.
I also say that it was a very interesting panel.
E eu acho que deve haver de todos os players a abertura para não deixarmos de repensar.
And I think that it needs to be open to everyone for us to think that we shouldn't stop rethinking about this.
Mas o ponto aqui importante é que nós temos que deixar de olhar este aspecto só na perspectiva de assistência social às comunidades que circundam as minas.
But the most important point that I think is that we should stop looking only about the social assistance in the perspectives of the mining.
Não é uma questão apenas de responsabilidade ou solidariedade social.
It's not only a point of social responsibility or solidarity.
mas nós temos que olhar na perspectiva de justiça e de sanidade humana.
And we also need to look upon the perspective of justice and human sanity.
E aqui vamos buscar a equidade.
And here also we're going to seek equity.
Uma equidade que não é socialismo,
Such equity that is not related to
mas uma equidade em
socialism,
termos de justiça social.
but equity that is related to human or social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, my panelists. I think it has been great. We are just about end of the time, so we have to wind up our conversation. But key takeaway is really like sharing, fair sharing of the benefits is critical. But the question and rethinking is really how to get that in an optimal way that does not undermine investment at the same time, provide benefits to the country. Thank you very much, and that comes to an end.